Okay, we've got some places to go over from the book of Genesis, and this is not a map section on the next test or quiz. This will be a matching, and some of them might be used more than once. So, just getting them up there right now. The Garden of Eden, you do not need to write down the Bible passages. The Garden of Eden is described in Genesis 2 as paradise, and it's a metaphor, it's symbolic for creation before human sinfulness enters into it. I think if you read the Bible literally, then Genesis 1 is the creation of the world, and Genesis 2 is the creation of the Garden of Eden. And it's interesting that Genesis 2 actually gives us some map directions. It says the river Gihon passes through there, and the river Pishon, and the Tigris and Euphrates. But if you put that into your MapQuest or your Google or whatnot, you would probably come up with nothing. So Eden is seen as an idyllic world, creation before human sinfulness enters into it, not a physical place. Similarly, the Tower of Babel might be based on a historical place. If you watch the video on the actual Noah's Ark that might have been attempted to be built before the Gilgamesh story and before the Noah story, they made reference to one of the chief ziggurats of Babylon, and the Tower of Babel story might be made to make fun of the Babylonians that way and kind of their foolishness and how big they think they are. But the Tower of Babel, again, is a metaphorical story. It takes place in the Bible after the Noah flood story, and it shows hubris, human excessive pride or arrogance, and trying to equal God. Kind of the same sin of Adam and Eve, the first humans in the Garden of Eden. The snake says, if you eat the fruit, you'll be like God and you'll know things. And so Eve eats the fruit and then gives it to Adam, and he just eats it. So the story of the Tower of Babel might be mocking the Babylonians themselves, but it might also be showing that even though there was the flood, that human sinfulness persisted after that. Mesopotamia is a real place. Again, Mesopotamia, just like a hippopotamia, a hippopotamus is a river horse. Mesopotamia means in the middle of the rivers. And Mesopotamia is where Abraham moves from. He moves from Ur, and he moves up to Haran, and then he moves to Canaan. And it's where the Gilgamesh story comes from. It's where the Utnapishtim flood story comes from. But for our purposes in the Bible, it's where Abraham comes from. He leaves behind the polytheism of Mesopotamia and begins moving towards belief in one God, or at least worship of one God. And in the Genesis stories, Mesopotamia is kind of the touchstone. Abraham sends his servant back to Mesopotamia to get a wife for Isaac. He doesn't want Isaac marrying the local girls. And in the story of Isaac's two sons, Esau and Jacob, Jacob is sent back to Mesopotamia to get a wife from the old country, from Mesopotamia, that Isaac's parents, or Isaac and Rebekah, are upset that Esau has married a local girl, a Canaanite woman. And so they send Jacob back to get a wife from Mesopotamia. And interestingly, Esau gets a wife who's a cousin as well. So Mesopotamia is the area that the Israelites moved from, or Abraham's family moved from, but there's still connections there. And it's also where the Jews will go into exile later on in Babylon, further down the road. Canaan is the promised land. It's the little strip of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. It's the land to which Abraham is called, and which God promises to him in the covenant. Egypt is interesting. When Abraham first moves to Canaan, there's a famine, and so he goes down to Egypt, and there's supplies there. And there's a she's not my wife, she's my sister little story where he temporarily loses Sarah and then gets her back. But that idea that Egypt is a place of refuge is going to come up later in the Bible. It's where Jacob's family goes. Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers. He becomes powerful in Egypt. And then when a famine hits the land of Canaan, the family of Jacob and the brothers of Joseph come down to Egypt to get grain. And so Egypt was seen as a place of refuge, a place of stability. And later on in Israel's history, when the Babylonians came, surrounded Jerusalem, destroyed the city, and then carried people away into exile, there were Jews who fled to Egypt and took refuge there. So Egypt was a place of refuge later. And interesting side note, there was a small Israelite community there that actually had a temple on an island in the Nile River. And they seem to have been welcomed there by the Egyptians as kind of mercenaries. So they had their own little Jewish community in exile and even a temple. Sodom and Gomorrah, the story comes out where God visits Abraham in the form of three people and tells Abraham he and Sarah are going to have a baby. And then God says, I'm going to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah and destroy the place because it's so wicked. And there's no real reason given for it. But if you look in the prophetic literature in the Bible, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel all talk about Sodom and Gomorrah as being places of evil. And they talk about a lack of social justice. They talk about people ignoring the poor. They talk about people, lying and committing adultery. So it seems to be a proverbial place of sin. And the story of Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed is one that students might even encounter in Sunday school. Lot and his family are the only good people. Lot is Abraham's nephew. They flee the city, and Lot's wife is told not to look back, but she looks back, and then she turns to a pillar of salt. Sodom and Gomorrah are down by the Dead Sea, and there's lots of salt pillars in the area, so maybe that story of Lot's wife is connected to that. But Sodom and Gomorrah were seen as places of evil, metaphors for it. And again, I had you read in the footnotes the crime of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah in the story of Lot is the threatened rape of Lot's guests. And there are people who take the Sodom and Gomorrah story and use it to promote kind of a homophobic attitude, this idea that God does not like gay people. And I had you read in the Catechism of the Catholic Church that Catholic teaching is that people who are gay need to be accepted with respect, compassion, sensitivity. Discrimination against them is completely wrong. So don't want to get into a lot of that, but Sodom and Gomorrah, a place of evil. Hebron is not really an important city. I've got a little slide to show you next. There's a little story where Abraham wants to buy a burial place for his wife Sarah after she dies. And there's a long negotiation between Abraham and the Canaanites about selling him this land. They want to give him a place to bury her, but Abraham insists on paying them, and he ends up paying more than he should. But Hebron is the first property that Abraham buys in the Promised Land, and God has promised him the Promised Land, but there's some reluctance on the part of the Canaanites to actually sell him land. And so he insists on paying for it, even though he ends up paying more than it's worth, so that he has at least a stake, he has a claim there. So Hebron is symbolically important today. It's not a practical place in modern-day Israel, Palestine, but symbolically, because it's Abraham's first purchased land, it's very, very important. Usually in my discussion of that, I talk about, make these disappear. I talk about Oregon cities and ask students to come up with what are the 5 largest Oregon cities, and usually they can come up with the first or 4 of them. And there's one that they always miss, and I find it humorous because it reminds me of Hebron, that Hebron is there's nothing really important there. If you look at these Oregon cities, there's something kind of important in each of those places, but the other big Oregon city is not really important in terms of having important things there. Same way that Hebron is symbolically important, even though there's no real practical industry or there's no important geography about it. It's got symbolic importance. I'm not sure if this Oregon city has the same kind of symbolic importance, but let you Google that and discover what it is.